Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry about Venom.
What is the most important section of a movie? The elevated stakes point in the middle, the all is lost moment before Act 3, or the final climax at the very end? All valid suggestions. Me, however, I would argue that the most important section of a movie is the section that makes you form your very first initial opinion, the section that you see before anything else, the beginning. Although Venom did manage to find an audience and made big bucks at the box office, it wasn't exactly advertised as the new greatest comic book film ever made, like was the case with some others earlier this year. While a lot of people were able to enjoy the movie, at the same time, they did also have some amount of issues with it. Issues that seem to boil down to a couple key aspects that keep coming up. The main villain wasn't overly interesting. The CGI wasn't exactly the new industry standard. The PG-13 rating wasn't as free of restrictions as an R rating would have been. To be fair to Venom, there is good stuff in here as well. Tom Hardy's relationship with Venom, for example, is very entertaining and is by far the very best thing this movie has to offer. But whether you love Venom or hate Venom, I think we can all agree on one thing. It wasn't as good as it maybe could have been. And the question that follows is why? Why wasn't Venom as good as it could have been? Those issues about the villain and the CGI, they are all valid. But me, I'd say the main reason extends a bit deeper. In my eyes, there's one core problem with this movie that kind of stained the audience's perception of it coming into it. A problem that more or less doomed Venom from the very first frame on. That problem is the beginning. Now, I don't mean to be harsh, but here it is. The opening 17 minutes of Venom, or at least 12 minutes out of those 17 minutes, make up one of the worst movie beginnings I've seen in a very, very long time. In other words, Venom doesn't start off so good. Which is why we are here today, fellas and fellarettes. Let's take a closer look at the highly problematic beginning of Venom and try to pinpoint what exactly is the problem with it. And by pinpointing the problems, at the end we'll see if there is a way to fix the beginning by redoing it. Even if you think Venom is already a good movie, we'll see if there is a way to make it just a little bit better. Just to refresh your memory, here is the opening of Venom. We start off with a 5-minute prologue. The spaceship crashes down, the villain Carlton Drake gets introduced, one symbiote escapes. The end. We then reset momentum with the main title and continue on to a 12-minute protagonist introduction section. Eddie Brock is established as a good guy reporter, he accuses Carlton Drake and then gets fired from his job and loses his girlfriend. Then some more symbiote stuff and that's it. The end. We then reset momentum with a 6-month time jump and carry on. Let's pause here. Now that you have the prologue beginning of Venom fresh in your mind, can you start to see the problem? Well, the problem is the fact that this movie doesn't only have a prologue, it has 2 prologues. The 5-minute crash site prologue and also the 12-minute San Francisco prologue. The definition of a prologue generally explains it as a separate preliminary introduction to the main story. Say you want to begin your movie by introducing your new main villain, a prologue is the way to go, as for example was the case in The Dark Knight with the Joker's bank robbery. The downside of a separate introductory prologue, however, is that it usually always ends up resetting momentum. You build momentum with your prologue beginning, but when it ends and you transition away to the main story, this momentum resets and it once again has to be built up from scratch. But usually prologues are only a tiny fraction of the movie's total runtime, so no problem. The problem arises when a film has not only one prologue, but 2 prologues. Because now, instead of being just 5 minutes long, your prologue section is 17 minutes long. Or in other words, around 20% of your entire 90-minute movie. While the spaceship crash section is very clearly a separate prologue, you could argue that the San Francisco introduction section isn't. And while I do believe that this section was not designed to be a separate prologue, that unfortunately is exactly what it ends up being. If you wonder why that is, it's because of this, the 6-month time jump. Pretty much everything we built up in the Eddie Brock introduction section, the sudden 6-month time jump completely wipes away. His job, gone. His girlfriend, gone. His life as we know it, gone. I understand this decision was made in order to develop Eddie as a character, yes, but sadly that doesn't change the fact that in the audience's eyes, because of this decision, the movie almost entirely restarts, aka momentum once again is reset. Time jumps during movies are always very dangerous because they can really mess up pacing. And while a properly inserted time jump can maybe work in the middle of a movie, it most likely will not work toward the end of Act 1. Simply because it's very difficult for the audience to get immersed in a film when that film keeps starting itself over again and again. Which is why 17 minutes of 2 separate prologues is never a good idea. Also, if there was no sudden 6-month time jump, maybe then the director of the movie himself wouldn't have to step out to specifically address why it takes a highly evolved and dangerous alien symbiote half a year to get to the nearest airport. The eternal #1 golden rule in screenwriting goes as follows: show, don't tell. If for example you're making a Robin Hood movie and you need to set up Robin Hood as a bow and arrow expert, do it like this. Don't have one character tell another character that Robin Hood is a bow and arrow expert. Instead, show us a scene where Robin Hood actually uses a bow and arrow. Simple, but very important. One of Venom's biggest weaknesses is that it doesn't follow this rule very efficiently. As in, there's a lot of telling instead of showing in this movie. The best example of this being the ending, where the evil symbiote is killed with fire, which apparently is their weakness. If you thought this ending was a bit anticlimactic, that's because unlike with high frequency sounds, fire had never been clearly visually established as a symbiote weakness, only briefly mentioned. And what's even worse, the movie is actually telling us one thing and showing us the exact opposite.
Sound frequency in MRI is really harmful, friend.
What is it? Sound is like his kryptonite?
Not all sounds.
And fire.
Fire and fire.
But even though there's quite a bit of telling instead of showing throughout the movie, in the 17-minute beginning section, honestly, it's out of control. To be blunt, pretty much the entire section is built on information that the film tells the audience and then expects us to accept as fact without any visual proof whatsoever to back it up. Eddie Brock, a highly skilled investigative reporter. How does the movie convey this information about him to us? Does it show the actual effect Eddie's reporting has on the world around him? Nah, he talks to the camera a bit like a reporter and then his boss says to him that the network loves the Eddie Brock show. Eddie's girlfriend, a righteous, talented lawyer. How do we know she's a lawyer? Do we actually see her in court doing lawyer stuff? No, but she wears a neat suit, like all female lawyers do. Also, we know that Eddie and his girlfriend really love each other because they kiss and then apparently have sex. Carlton Drake, an evil billionaire crook who kills innocent civilians with his pharmaceuticals company. How do we know this? Because Eddie says so. How does Eddie know this? Well, never mind that, he just does. Plus, later on, he also reads a PDF file with some names on it. So, there you go. Long story short, show, don't tell. If you don't show the audience your movie, they have nothing to watch. And if they have nothing to watch, they have nothing to enjoy.
This guy, he is all the way bad. Jack, if you just give...
Who's your source?
Excuse me?
Who's your source, Eddie?
I have a hunch.
This isn't the Wild Wild West. We do the work. We provide evidence.
Resetting momentum and telling instead of showing aside, the biggest crime of Venom's beginning might be the fact that it's redundant, as in it isn't necessary, as in it's a waste of time, as in it shouldn't exist. To be fair, the spaceship crash section does need to be there. It introduces the symbiotes, it introduces Carlton Drake. That's fine, that's required. But this 12-minute San Francisco prologue section, no. For the most part, this doesn't need to exist. Why do I say that? Because pretty much everything this section tries to hastily establish, all of it gets established later on anyway, in a much better way. For example, one of the bigger setups in this prologue section is the love relationship between Eddie Brock and his girlfriend. But because the film is so quick and so on the nose about it, it never really works. While these characters do kiss and they do have sex, the movie never truly sells Eddie's feelings for her, not until later on when they are separated. When Eddie sees that she is with another guy, that's when his emotions start to seem real and genuine. And because Eddie's feelings get established here, that kind of makes this whole initial love section unnecessary. And if it's unnecessary, it doesn't need to be in the movie. Same with Eddie being a talented investigative reporter. Even though the movie tries to establish him as a skilled reporter through a short montage, it's not very effective, because that's all it is, a short montage of Eddie talking to camera about stuff unrelated to the movie. But when Eddie has been fired and still puts his life in risk by sneaking into Carlton Drake's secret lab, that's when he begins to resemble a real, actual, dedicated reporter. And so again, this earlier stuff isn't required. Even with Carlton Drake, this film very obsessively tries to convince us that Carlton Drake is evil and that he's killing innocents in his lab. It tries to convince us with Eddie's beliefs, it tries to convince us with the PDF file he finds. But later on, we actually see Carlton Drake killing innocents in his lab, which is quite a bit more effective. And since we see it here, what's the point of all these desperate convincing attempts earlier? I understand that Eddie's suspicions toward Drake have to be established, but at the same time, there's gotta be a better way to do it, and we'll get to that in a second. Unless a scene or a section in your movie is absolutely crucial for the plot or for character development, it shouldn't exist. At least not usually. And since a lot of the stuff in this 12-minute San Francisco prologue section is neither, it would have been wise to cut most of it out. Maybe then we would have had time to see some of that infamous deleted footage that Tom Hardy apparently thinks is the greatest material he did for this whole movie.
What was your favorite scene to film?
Well, there are scenes that aren't in this movie. There are like 30-40 minutes worth of scenes that aren't in this movie.
Really, your favorite ones?
Yeah, all of them, yeah.
Later.
Or clarification, whatever you'd like to say on that report about the half an hour of footage that was cut from the movie. I guess you had some interview.
No, that's got me saying, all right, yeah, no, let me just, okay, yeah, all right, yeah, this movie is awesome, everything we want is in it, and everything I want is in it, and more.
Now that we have identified the core problems with Venom's beginning, let's see if we can find a proper way to make it all function a little bit more smoothly. And to be fair to the writers of Venom, it's always easier to identify problems and fixes after the movie is done. Also, I'm not saying this is all objectively better, I'm just giving my own take on it. But here we go. First up, we need to get rid of the feeling of a second prologue. And the only way to do this is by removing the 6-month time jump. Instead of waiting around doing nothing for half a year, Eddie Brock is contacted by the female scientist almost right after he gets fired. Now, just like that, there is no break or reset in momentum. Eddie can have a depressed moment of defeat after the firing, but this way we can stay with him through the whole thing, without this section feeling like just another prologue. And if you do need a time jump to develop Carlton Drake's symbiote research, then have a time jump. But have it after the initial spaceship crash section, not after 17 minutes. Do that and there's no more double prologue. By moving up the time jump, we do create a couple story problems, one of them being the rivalry Eddie has with Carlton Drake. If there's no time jump, there's no time for Eddie's hatred of Drake to stew. But for me, there is a very simple solution for this. A solution that also fixes our telling instead of showing problem. The solution is that the rivalry is already there. Instead of beginning with Eddie reporting on whatever news unrelated to the main story, the movie begins with Eddie secretly investigating Drake and his pharmaceuticals company. Now, we see Eddie being a real investigative reporter. We see that his suspicions about Drake being evil and killing innocent test subjects are true. And when Eddie goes to his boss with whatever evidence he has, he gets fired, because Drake is a billionaire and has leverage on the network. And like that, done. No more telling instead of showing. Another problem created by moving up the time jump is Eddie's relationship with Michelle Williams. Now that there's no time jump, there's no way they can split up at the beginning of the movie, simply because there wouldn't be enough time for them to be apart in order for it to work. But interestingly, the fix I see for this also works as a fix for the redundancy aspect we discussed. As in, if there's no time for Eddie and Michelle Williams to separate, then don't have them separate at all. Have them already be separated. As I mentioned before, Eddie's true feelings for his now ex-girlfriend never seem real until the two are separated. This fairy tale on the nose relationship that they initially have, it never really comes off as real. And so, because it isn't necessary for the plot or for character development, just cut it out. Instead of having Eddie and Michelle Williams be together at the beginning of Venom, just allude to an earlier time when they used to be together, as long as you make it clear that Eddie still has feelings for her. Also, because Eddie and his ex-girlfriend are already separated, the real reason why she left him could now function as a nice mystery. As Venom learns more about Eddie throughout the story, so does the audience. And finally, at some point, we realize that the real reason that drove these two lovers apart was Eddie's obsession with Carlton Drake. I'd say that's a pretty powerful reveal, and personally I do think it has more potential as a mystery instead of being used up right at the beginning. But most importantly, no more 12 minutes of redundancy. And with that, there you have it, fellas and fellarettes. You now know my problems with Venom's beginning, you now know my fixes for those problems. Would these fixes have made this a better movie and lifted up its Rotten Tomatoes critical score? Definitely. Well, maybe. Or, I don't know.
Alright, so listen, why don't you give me a call when you want to start taking things a little more seriously. Here's my card.
Someone tell Phil Mento to delete themselves.
I've done it. I found
Okay, so like I mentioned in my Sherlock Holmes video, recently there's been an increasing amount of Memento haters popping up on Twitter, with most of them basically just graciously expressing their slight dissatisfaction with my titles and thumbnails. But in addition to just that, I've also noticed a couple people tweeting actual proper arguments against the points I make in my videos in an effort to invalidate them and overall just kinda dunk on me, which is fine, we're all here to learn. And while most of those arguments boil down to Twitter users and I having very different perceptions of competence